Good morning, everyone. We are pleased to present our intervention titled Conservation Treatment and Protective Mounting on Untitled Polyptych, 1993, a work by Stefano Arienti in silicone on tissue paper. Stefano Arienti, born in 1961, is a well-known Italian artist who began exhibiting his work in 1985. The process of creating the artwork is essential in his practice. He openly shows his interest in arte povera and process art, especially in the work of Alighiero Boetti. Stefano Arienti's works are created by appropriating existing images that he collects, catalogs, and then reworks using a wide variety of manipulation techniques: punching, erasing, tracing, scratching, cutting, and covering are just some of the actions he performs. This broad method creates new imaging and meanings connected to memory and time. Using the artist's own words, since the beginning of my career, I have found it much more stimulating to use materials that might be called poor materials, which I found carry a strong poetic charge precisely because they are everyday consumer materials, continuously used by people. And again, we live in a kind of dictatorship of objects, and consequently of images, and it may seem that they are only meant to be consumed. However, we can easily enter into them, create new ones, and make them live differently, making them independent from the past, but also from ourselves. For those who are not familiar with him, I'd like to take the opportunity to briefly present some works resulting from his unique artist research, focused on reworking everyday materials and objects. The well-known turbines are among the first outcomes of this research, created through small gestures like folding the page of a book, a comic, or a phone directory. Moreover, some of these fragile sculptures have already undergone important and well-documented restorations. The so-called cartoline, postcards, a series created between 1919 and 1991, are part of a research in which Arienti engraves the tales of images, referencing artworks, monuments, and landscapes, onto polystyrene sheets, while also incorporating postcard or greetings cards. The engraving is achieved through heat or organic solvent, which dissolve and thin the material. The drawing becomes visible thanks to backlighting with neon tubes. By choosing polystyrene, a fragile material commonly used for protecting and packaging delicate objects, the artist established a particular relationship with time and the concept of the ephemeral. Also well known are the works made on posters of famous Impressionist paintings, where the three-dimensionality of the brushstrokes is recreated using layers of modeling clay or colored wax. The final effect is that of a highly textured painting, emphasizing color, a paradoxal restoration, as the artist himself states, halfway between parody and homage. Also on posters, we find interventions involving the application of zippers, created by cutting the paper and gluing zippers at specific points. Or in the work Poppies from 2010, where a large format poster was entirely torn into longitudinal strips, which were sewn back together using red thread and a sewing machine. Let's now turn to the artwork at the center of this presentation. Untitled Polyptych is composed of 5 pieces made on sheets of tissue paper, each measuring 100 by 70 cm, onto which landscape scenes were drawn using a slide projector and a silicone-based medium. Each sheet was individually mounted onto a white painted wooden panel and framed with spacer and glass. The photo you see here shows the work after the conservation treatment. Looking more closely, we can see how the silicone, an industrial type commonly used in construction, was applied thickly and directly onto the paper using a caulking gun. Under raking light, the material's thickness and the physicality of the application became especially apparent. At the same time, a magnified image of the paper support reveals the uneven texture of the thin, low-weight tissue paper used, characterized by its fragility and poor quality. An analysis of the worst condition revealed recurring issues across all 5 sheets. The weight of the silicone medium caused significant deformation of the paper due to gravity, influenced by the distribution of adhesive spots, mostly in the upper part, and the material's uneven application. The sheets displayed with widespread uneven yellowing caused by light exposure due to the lack of the UV protection, the highly refined short fiber pulp, and the acidity of the wooden backing. Macro and raking light images highlighted surfaces dust deposits adhering to the silicone due to its tacky texture and typical cockling of paper exposed to high humidity over time. The issue of moisture is clearly visible on the back of the frames. In the lower portion, a distinct tide line indicates direct contact with water and subsequent rising damp. This accidental event affected all 5 works, likely creating an internal microclimate with relative humidity levels close to 100% for an extended period. While all 5 works showed similar conservation issues, such as deformations and varying degree of yellowing, each one was affected to a different extent. In specimen 2 of 5, in addition to the general alterations, a noticeable vertical contraction of the paper support was observed, likely caused by water percolation due to condensation that had formed inside the frame. Similar contractions of paper support were observed in the lower part of specimen 4 of 5, where water rinsing by capillarity came into direct contact with the paper. This caused prominent tide line due to the solubilization of oxidation product. Finally, specimen 5 of 5, which was in the worst condition, showed not only the issues already mentioned, but also a tear in the upper left corner near a glue spot. This tear caused the heavy sheet to slip downward, creating additional and pronounced distortions. Once the frame was opened and the sheets repositioned horizontally, a marked darkening along the left edge became visible, likely due to prolonged exposure to direct sunlight or a heat source. After carefully analyzing the conservation issues and understanding the causes that led the work to the poor condition we have seen, the planning phases of the interventions led us to make significant decisions, in particular to modify the mounting system of the paper sheets. The tears and deformation caused by the weight of the silicone and increased humidity clearly demonstrated that the original mounting system was not adequate to ensure the stability of the work. Therefore, a new system was developed to better distribute the weight of the sheets evenly. During the flattening and stain reduction process, the use of water, although necessary, was carefully calibrated, considering the sensitivity of both the support and the medium. The artist himself was consulted about our proposed solutions and fully accepted them, being well aware of the deterioration that had occurred over time. He expressed particular satisfaction in restoring the legibility of the drawing, an aspect that, as you may have noticed, had become almost completely compromised. Before handing over to Leonardo, with whom I shared all phases of the project and treatment, I would like to raise a final question. What does it mean to restore an ephemeral artwork like this, or others made with fragile, unconventional materials? Is it a kind of therapeutic obstinacy? Is it simply a professional opportunity? We must remember that the contemporary art market often attributes significant, sometimes disproportionate value to these works compared to more traditional art. Looking back, we are convinced that conserving ephemeral materials is entirely possible. Conservation solutions can often be found by rethinking traditional restoration technique and integrating them with more recent practices. Now I'll hand it over to my colleague Leonardo Albasini, who will present the intervention steps in more details.
As Andrea mentioned earlier, the intervention required detaching the artworks from their wooden supports. After gently dusting them with a soft bristle brush, several solvents were tested. We identified the initial swelling effects after about 10 minutes of applying propylene carbonate. Given the stubbornness of the adhesive, partially caused by aging, we needed to significantly extend the solvent application time on the tissue paper. Therefore, we decided to create a gel loaded with this solvent to enhance effectiveness. To prevent issues related to gore formation, we used 10% Clusel G in ethanol, mixed with 50% propylene carbonate by volume, creating a stable gel that ensures proper swelling of the adhesive with application times of 2 to 3 hours per spot. After detachment, the paper supports, despite their individual issues, all should got mechanical strength. This allowed us, as planned from the beginning, to use false margin for the planarity recovery. Restoring the planarity of these objects was a crucial phase of the intervention and was made possible only through the application of false margins, given the textural quality of the technique. However, because the tissue paper is translucent and semi-transparent, as you can see from the dark background in the close-up on the right, several tests were necessary to identify materials that, in combination, would provide good mechanical strength, excellent adhesion, and at the same time be not visually noticeable. All these considerations were essential because the false margins were also used in the final mounting on conservation board. As you can see in this image, the transparency of the tested materials was evaluated directly on the board itself. The extreme sensitivity of the paper support to water required excluding all water-based adhesives. Therefore, the materials tested were 6% Clusel G in ethanol, Plextol B500 thickened with 1% of Clusel, and the acrylic resin Lascaux 498. On the left, a detail shows how Clusel was unsuitable as it tended to heavily saturate the tissue paper despite being applied through reactivation with ethanol. On the right, we see the paper adhesive combination that was ultimately selected. The choice was therefore made to use 19.9 gram Moriki tissue paper combined with Lascaux acrylic resin. Each false margins was reactivated with a solvent, in this case butyl acetate, to minimize adhesive penetration, and applied with a 3 mm overlap, carefully following the original support contractions. To restore their planarity, the 5 sheets were humidified through capillary action, using a Gore-Tex membrane allowing the paper to soften slowly and in a controlled manner. In this case, 30 minutes of humidification were sufficient because, as you can see in the image on the left, the tissues were very reactive to water. This sensitivity comes from the translucent, low weight and coated supports tending to absorb and release water very quickly. So, during the drying, the behavior of the artworks was constantly monitored. Following the planarity recovery, the tide lines previously mentioned by my colleague became more visible. We therefore choose to treat them locally with small brush application of a reducing agent, specifically the terbutylaminoborane, in an hydroalcoholic solution to limit the amount of water applied. As the close-up image shows, the bleaching effect of the terbutylaminoborane also provided a pleasing aesthetic improvement. On this particular piece, the reducing agent in alcohol solution was also sprayed onto the yellowed area caused by sunlight exposure. Multiple steps were required to achieve this result that you can see on the right. At the end of the treatment, each piece was mounted on conservation board, thus avoiding direct contact with the wooden panel using the previous mounting, which was retained as a historically significant element. As explained earlier, the false margin made of Japanese tissue were used to secure the artwork to the board with Tyvek tape, maintaining the achieved planarity. Once mounted on their final board and before reframing, deposits stuck to the silicone were removed, since silicones tends to trap dust. On the right, you can see a before and after comparison. The 5 pieces were finally rehoused in the original box frames, with new museum quality glass. The original wooden spacers and polywood panels from the historic mounting were retained, and the backing frames were added to ensure structural stability. The precautions taken, fully supported by the artist, were essential to ensure the artwork's future preservation and proper display. The difference visible in these before and after images clearly reflect this. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you.